This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay with a short video to describe how to set up your lab notebook. This video applies to anyone who is in one of my high school science classes, although the front pages that are included for your particular class may vary. In this video, I want to cover how you set up your notebook and briefly how you're going to write the lab reports. The first thing you need to do is to decide which style of notebook you prefer. I don't care if you use a spiral or a binder notebook. Either one will work. Just use the one that you're most comfortable with. These notebooks will hold printed handouts that will be distributed by me, along with all of your notes, your data of the experiment, and the stuff that you need to write after the experiment is done. You need to print out the front pages that are specific to your class. There is a folder that is called the Lab Notebook Front Pages that will be found in, depending on your class, either the Google Drive folder for your class, the Edmodo class folder, or I might just send it to you by email. Inside this folder, you will find a variety of files that you need to print out, and these are the pages that will go at the beginning of your notebook. If you are using a spiral notebook, I've put page borders on the front pages, and they are also on the labs, and they have been sized so that you can cut around this page border and it fits quite nicely in a spiral notebook. I have found that if you tape the corners down diagonally, this tends to work best in a spiral notebook setup. If you're using a 3-ring binder, then all you need to do is hole punch down this side, and there's plenty of room in the margins. You need to organize your pages in the correct order. The pages should be numbered in the top right-hand corner of each page, so that's like right up here. You only need to number the odd numbers, so starting with page 1. The first two pages, pages 1 and 3, are left blank for your table of contents, which you will complete as you add lab experiments into your notebook. The next page should be one of those files you've printed out, your science lab safety rules. And be sure to read those rules because we don't spend a whole lot of time going over them in class. The next page, page 7, should be the lab notebook format directions, and I'll talk about them a little bit more later, followed by the grading page, which gives you some idea of what I'm looking for, and you leave the next page blank so I have someplace to record your grades. Then after that point, there may be other pages that are specific to your own class. And this will vary, as I said, depending upon what class you're in. And once you've put in all of those files, then your first lab report will fall on the next blank page, whether it is page 13 or 15 or 17 or 19. So writing your lab report. The lab report has 3 key sections. There are the lab directions, the lab data, and the lab discussion. Got some nice alliteration going on here. The directions generally are teacher prepared. These usually are provided to you in a handout that you will print out before class, but occasionally I do ask you to come up with your own directions. The lab data is what you're going to be recording during class, and generally this is all that we have time for. You need to make sure that you write down any of the measurements that you take, and you need to organize this data in some form in your notes. I would prefer that you put your data in your notebook right close to where the beginning of your lab is, either on that first handout or right away on the next page, so that I can see that you've been keeping track of whatever measurements they are while the lab is happening, instead of making them up perhaps, or certainly coming up with them again at home later. And then finally, the lab discussion includes a summary of the lab, a connection between the lab experience and the concepts that we're talking about in the chapter, and a connection to real life. So there'll be 3 parts in your discussion section as well. The lab directions go on the right-hand page, and this may seem a little strange because we think of, opening a book here, and of course we start reading on the left. But that's not what I want. I want my lab directions over here on the right. The left-hand page is very important, but it's not for the directions. In the directions, and as I said, most of this will be provided for you. You have a purpose statement or a question that's going to be answered. background information to help you understand what's going on, the materials that are needed for that particular lab, and the procedure you need to follow. Sometimes there's also space to write down some data. The data needs to also be on a right-hand page, and you can use another right-hand page. Just move that page, turn that to the next page if you have no more space on the handout page that you've put in. The data is the facts, and I really strongly suggest you organize it as a table or a chart so that you can keep track of what you've put down and where it applies, what part of the experiment. Be precise in your measurements, of course be accurate in your measurements, and make sure you have all the data collected before you leave class. Read that procedure before you start your experiment to make sure you know what you are doing and what you have to measure. Now we get to the lab discussion. This is the part of the lab notebook that I am most interested in, and it goes on the left-hand page across from the directions. So when we open up your lab, what I will see is here's this interesting stuff that you have written down in your discussion, and it's sitting there across from that page that you probably have taped in because I provided it for you. In your lab discussion, as I said, there are 3 parts. There's a summary that said what you did. And this can be just a few sentences. In this lab, and you just explain the procedure. The evaluation should be what it shows. Why is it important? Why would I pick this experiment? So think about the concepts we're talking about in that week, and how do those concepts connect to this lab? Why is this lab showing something how is this lab showing something that connects to what we're studying in class? And then the final section, which can give people problems, is to try to come up with some connection with reality. How does this idea that we're talking about in this lab, what concept that's underneath all of our experiments, how is it connected to something in real life? Or you can be creative and just respond to the ideas with a cartoon or a picture or a poem. That is fine too. If you have to, you can go to the web to look up a real-life connection. But I much prefer that you try to come up with this on your own. I would rather to have you struggle to make those, hopefully not struggle too much, but really try to make some connections or be creative than to just look up the concept and print out something that's on the web. Show me your thinking. That's what I really want to see. Sometimes you also have graphs or specific calculations that I tell you have to do, or there may be a pre-lab assignment, something you have to look up or investigate, and I may give you particular questions which I write as Q&As that you need to answer. Any of these parts of the lab also go on a second right-hand page or a second left-hand page. I am not as particular about where they fall, just make sure they're included. Why do I do this? Because I want to know what you are thinking, how you are connecting what we're doing in science lab and your real life. Science is not something apart from life. There are very strong connections, and we don't always see them, and I'm trying to help you see them through the way I do my classes and encouraging you to think about it in this lab setup. So with this format, I can see the directions. I know what lab we're talking about by looking at the right-hand page, but then I can very quickly read the discussion section, which is what I'm really interested in. I'm not so concerned about, well, I am concerned, but I'm not that interested in the numbers that you got in the data, but I am interested in how you apply that on that left-hand page. Here's a sample report from 9th grade biology, just giving you a brief idea about what sorts of things could be said in the summary, or in the evaluation. Remember, said the evaluation, you're saying this lab shows. What is it showing? How is that connected to this first lab where we're talking about the signs of life? And then here, the reality connection or creative response. The person was making a connection between the yeast that they observed in the experiment and yeast that is used to make bread. If you are really stumped, I do have other examples I can share with you, and I will take a look at your first reports to make sure you're getting it. So finally, you need to set up your notebook before your first class because we start with labs. So you want to be ready to go. You will have received your first lab handout before class. Bring it printed out to the lab, and you'll be able to put in your data, and then later on at home, write that left-hand page. It's also sometimes a very smart idea to make a note of who was in your lab group, because sometimes you find that you're missing data, and when you get home you need to know who to call. Most classes do have a lab report to write each week. I strongly encourage you to write them each week, maybe the day after class, if not the day of. They can really pile up if you forget to write your lab reports. Notebooks are spot checked throughout the semester, but they are graded at the end of each semester, and they generally count about 30% of your grade. So keep up with those lab reports, and you'll get a good percentage towards your final grade. So hopefully now you feel a little more ready to set up your lab report, your lab notebook, and write your lab reports. We'll be doing it right away in class, so get your lab notebook ready.